Hey guys, it's Faye, and today I'm sharing the build I've been theory crafting and planning to use as a league starter in the 3.3 Incursion League. Before I get into the build, I'd like to mention that some things could be subject to change due to final patch notes not being available yet. Unfortunately, I'm going to be out of town right before the league starts and have to upload this before the final patch notes are dropped. Keep eyes on the Google Doc. I'll be taking my laptop with me when I go out of town to add the builds, Path of Building import link, post the final tree with the 3.3 changes, as well as leveling trees, and to tweak the build if needed. Also, I'm using what little footage ZiggyD has shown of the skills, since obviously there's no way I could record this build since it involves a new skill and a fire trap that looks nothing like the current version. With that out of the way, let's talk about the Elementalist Flame Sapper build. First off, there's two main skills, Flamethrower Trap and the now spammable Fire Trap to supplement it. I'm going with the Witch's Elementalist Ascendancy class over Saboteur. While the Saboteur offers AoE utility, I still feel Elementalist is viable, and it's my preference since I haven't played the Ascendancy in a long time, and prolif is good again. By paying and some utility being lost, Elementalist has some amazing raw power for elemental trap builds. So Ignite is finally back. It's back. Hopefully. Ignite is finally getting some love again in 3.3. In general, Ignite has been buffed to deal 25% more damage. There have also been buffs to a large portion of the skill tree's Fire, Ignite, and Burn nodes, as well as numerous support gems. As a reminder, here's how the newer Ignite formula works. 40% of your base fire damage is further modified by generic damage modifiers, fire damage modifiers, burning damage modifiers, and damage over time modifiers. I kept this in mind when picking support gems, especially since I want a nice hybrid of hits and ignites. As a general rule, fire/elemental damage is a great pick since it factors into both the hit and ignite formulas. For example, something like Concentrate Effect only affects hits and never ignites, as that particular support gem only provides a more area damage modifier. Chance to Ignite is now known as Combustion, and it's an amazing support gem now. There's a more fire damage modifier, a gigantic chance to ignite, and enemies ignited by supported skills lose 19% of their fire resistance. All of these changes seem to fall in line with the goal ZiggyD had in mind. Quote, "The idea behind this is to make both hits and ignite more rewarding for your investment." You can check out the official post about ignite changes. I linked it in the description below. Moving on, here's a quick list of the pros and cons of the build. So for pros, we have lots of buttons: Flamethrower Trap, Fire Trap, Orb of Storms, and Siphoning Trap, which you're going to be using fairly regularly. It's League Starter viable. You don't absolutely need the 3 uniques that I'm going to be using with it in order to level and do early maps. It can run Reflect maps without any problems. You have survivability with Mind Over Matter. Elementalist Mastermind of Discord provides Herald of Ash DPS and synergy with Mind Over Matter. The Beacon of Ruin Elemental Proliferation without needing any kind of prolif support. Also, the Beacon of Ruin baseline chills and shocks are much larger with minimal damage. What this means is even if you only do 1 damage to cause a chill or a shock, it will have a very good threshold. So for cons, lots of buttons again. It really depends on the types of builds you like to play. Personally, I don't know. I don't mind lots of buttons, but I'm usually a 1 skill or 2-skill piece of trash, because that's how I roll, but this seems really fun and some people do like using a lot more skills. No regen maps are going to be awful to run, that's just the way it goes. There's the lack of the Saboteur's trap utility in that we don't have the automatic triggering, the chance for traps to trigger twice, we don't have the cooldown, we don't have their regen, but we have all of our other stuff. It requires Sunblast and Cheap Construction, 2 of Cheap Construction actually. These are the 3 required uniques, but they shouldn't be too hard to get our hands on, even though with the trap updates they're going to be way more popular. There is a lack of skill gem space with sockets because of 2 main skills, and the build's a little bit too point heavy to invest in additional frenzy charges on the passive tree. It just wasn't worth marching down like 4 points of highway nodes for the tiny more multiplier, which is really good. More damage is great, but the base 3 should work fine. I'm going to go over gear next. I'm using this as a league starter, so my requirement is that I don't need much to get to endgame. Since this isn't a Saboteur build, there are 3 required uniques. Get these when you can and try to have them by the time you get to maps at the very least. While these help leveling, you can do fine without them if prices are initially high. First off, the Sunblast belt. The relevant stat here is the 80% reduced trap duration. This is supplemented by 2 Cheap Construction unique jewels that bring trap duration to 100% reduced, so they activate immediately. There will likely be high demand for these in 3.3 since so many new trap skills were buffed and released. However, these are not super rare unique drops, so supply should keep prices affordable at the very least. Next, I'm going to cover non-required uniques and gearing options. Once again, these are things to look at if you have the currency and you want to invest in the build more. They're absolutely not required. First off, you're gonna want a good body armor. Tinker Skin isn't mandatory anymore, since Fire Trap is now spammable. The new Charged Trap support covers Frenzy Charge generation. Even Siphoning Trap covers the survivability aspect. Because of this, I recommend either a Cloak of Defiance or a Belly of the Beast unique chest. If you still want to use Tinker Skin, go for it, but I'll be picking a more survivability oriented chest. There's also the amazing new temple items which can roll some pretty absurdly good mods, so be adaptable and look for common sense survivability stats like percentage life, max life, damage taken as an element, resists, etc. The Searing Touch unique staff is also a natural fit for this type of build. Absolutely not required, but a decent goal item that shouldn't break the bank as much as some other items can. Even so, I expect these to be pretty expensive early on in the league since Ignite has seen some major buffs, and skills such as Incinerate have been reworked entirely and people will be excited to play them. Since there are technically 2 main skills in this build, using a staff also makes it so you can more easily link Flamethrower Trap and Fire Trap. Later on, you might find good Shaper items that can alleviate having to use a staff. Speaking of Shaper items, another great goal item is a pair of Shaper gloves with the skills that throw traps through an additional trap mod. This is a global mod and it's super valuable. The Zoph's Heart/Blood amulet also works for this build, since the Elementalist's Elemental Conflux overrides Avatar of Fire. There's also the usual options for unique flasks. The Wise Oak is always a nice pick for Elemental Pen, but as always be aware that you will have to manage your gear so that your fire res is highest to gain the benefit. As Ziri's Promise quickly becomes affordable in new leagues, be sure to get one with a decent elemental damage roll if you decide to use one. There's also the usual defensive flasks, stuff like Roomies, Taste of Hate, that kind of thing, but I just wanted to cover DPS flasks, as defensive flasks are much more universal. The passive tree will be located in the description below with leveling trees. As I mentioned before, the 3.3 skill tree API is not yet available. In general, I try to focus on both DPS and survivability. You could adjust the tree either way if you want to have either more DPS or more survivability. I also want to note that this build is very passive heavy and did not have room for pathing to the frenzy charges. Even so, the base 3, like I said before, should work just fine. Since I'm going to be out of town, please refer to the video description or the Google Doc for updates to these trees. As a quick note, investing heavily in cast speed will not make Flamethrower Trap too amazing because it has a hard cap of 10 hits per second per trap. I'll briefly cover Keystone picks next. This build only uses 2 Keystones, Elemental Overload and Mind Over Matter. Elemental Overload is why I'm not invested in crit. It's a flat 40% more elemental damage multiplier, and since trap crits cannot activate it, I'm going to use an Orb of Storm setup to gain this buff. Mind Over Matter is taken because it's a solid defensive pick and utilizes the mana pool as a safety net, and gives us a much higher effective life pool. In terms of Elementalist Ascendancy picks, in order, it's pretty straightforward. First, Shaper of Desolation. You gain your elemental confluxes in sequence and then all 3 for 2 seconds. Since this is a time-based rotating buff, it's not the most obviously useful node in the world, but it's still very viable in that Chilling is a natural survivability buff, and Shocking comes into play with the next node, and Igniting Conflux works with what this build is pretty much about. Next, Beacon of Ruin. Elemental Proliferation's AoE has been buffed overall in 3.3, and this node has also been increased to compensate, with the new prolif radius being increased from 12 to 18. The biggest juicy buff here is that this passive now grants 20% more damage with Ignite. This makes for a total of 45% more damage with Ignite combined with the general 25% more damage buff. Slows from chills always slow by at least 10% with this node. Shocks with your hits always increase damage taken by enemies by at least 20%. This means when Shocking Conflux rolls, you always get 20% increased damage against an enemy after it's been shocked. After the shock nerfs, this is very valuable as an increased damage source from spamming Fire Trap to shock with Conflux stages for Flamethrower Trap and Fire Trap to deal even more damage. The 20% increased effect of non-damaging ailments is also nice in that it stacks on top of the previous 2 effects, making shocks cause enemies to be even more vulnerable and chills to be even more defensive. More importantly, elemental ailments will proliferate much farther, spreading those super buffed ignites, shocks, and chills. It's important to note that despite the fact the Beacon of Ruin node says your hits, it actually does work for traps and totems, much like how Elemental Equilibrium also works with traps and totems. A topic on why this works could take up an entire video, but the wording here works in this instance, and it's just one of the game's idiosyncrasies. ZiggyD has stated that they need to update the wording in certain areas, but it's not a priority at this time. With your Merc lab points, grab Pendulum of Destruction. This node alternates between massive AoE and elemental damage in 5-second intervals. While this isn't the most impressive node ever, it's a respectable amount of power. Pendulum of Destruction leads to the node that's actually amazing, Mastermind of Discord. While affected by Herald of Ash, the Elementalist gains 25% Fire Pen. Heralds are also buffed by 25% and have 25% reduced mana reservation, naturally synergizing with the Mind Over Matter Keystone. I mentioned this in most of my build guides, but the Pantheon really isn't a big deal in most builds. They're not permanent, you can swap them on the fly. I plan on using the Brine King to prevent stuns, and Rislotha for Life Flasks. You can swap as needed. If a map has Burning Ground, take the Pantheon power to negate that entirely and so forth. It's all your preference. Next, the gem setups for the build. Once again, I ask that you check the Google Doc in the description for any sort of updates. Path of Building is not currently updated with all the new 3.3 content, and so this is maximum theory crafting mode for Flamethrower Trap and Fire Trap. One consideration right now is possibly putting Immolate in the Fire Trap setup instead of Controlled Destruction because of its additional fire damage scaling. The rest of the setup should stay the same as they are very much standard. Flamethrower Trap will be linked to the following: Combustion, Concentrated Effect, Controlled Destruction, Trap and Mind Damage, and Fire Pen. I chose to prioritize hits a bit more with Flamethrower Trap. I'm currently unsure on if Empower would beat out Fire Pen, as detailed scaling of this new skill is not yet available. Fire Pen is much easier to obtain anyways, since level 3 empowers will take a while to become available and will be pricey. Please keep an eye on the Google Doc. A quick note, Advanced Traps has replaced Trap cooldown recovery. This seems like a no-brainer on Flamethrower Trap since it has a pretty lengthy cooldown. The problem with this new gem is that it grants increased skill effect duration, which would increase the time it takes for a trap to activate. This would effectively cancel a decent amount of the reduced trap duration granted by the Sunblast belt and 2 cheap construction jewels to have thrown traps instantly explode. Fire Trap will be the build's clearing skill since it's now spammable. Flamethrower Trap has a noticeable cooldown and is meant for harder single targets and bosses. Fire Trap will be linked to multiple/cluster traps when you get it, charged traps, Combustion, Controlled Destruction, and Fire Pen. Trap and Mind Damage is beaten out by Controlled Destruction, and the damage over time component of Fire Trap is now also affected by spell damage in addition to the scale's hits. Even so, Immolate may edge out Controlled Destruction with its added fire damage. Charge Traps is on the scale because Fire Trap is now spammable, and this will be my method of gaining Frenzy charges. The power charges from the support gem will also help Orb of Storms crit more often in order to proc Elemental Overload, since for whatever reason traps cannot proc EO on hit. I feel like the utility of the Charge Trap support gem is worth it despite the fact that the build is not crit multiplier focused. I didn't want my Fire Trap damage area to be smaller, so I opted out of Concentrated Effect, since the new version of Fire Trap has its local Burning Ground degen affected by spell damage. I dropped Ignite Proliferation from consideration since it only affects Ignite damage noticeably, and because Elementalist already has built-in proliferation via Beacon of Ruin. As I have said previously, this is a hybrid hit and Ignite build with a bit more emphasis on hits. Fire Trap at its core has 3 damage components: the initial hit damage, its Burning Ground degen, and Ignites. Having supports that affect the hit and Burning Ground with Fire Trap's amazing new flat Ellie scaling doesn't hurt. I'm using Orb of Storms as my usual Elemental Overload and Cursing go-to. Orb of Storms is linked to Curse on Hit, Flammability, and Clarity. I'm running Clarity in order to satiate the high mana cost of traps, as well as having the extra mana regen for survivability with Mind Over Matter. Clarity is socketed here to make room for Arcane Surge in the next setup. Next up, Herald of Ash and Movement. I will be using Herald of Ash as Elementalist benefits from Heralds greatly, and because Herald of Ash still has that relatively new ability to affect spellfire damage. Flame Dash is my movement skill of choice combined with faster casting and Arcane Surge. Level Arcane Surge so that it procs every 1 to 2 Flame Dash casts as you level. If you overlevel Arcane Surge, it's going to be extremely difficult to proc. Cast when damage taken is back again, as with many other builds. I will be linking it to Summon Stone Golem and Immortal Call. Siphoning Trap is also here because there's room, but keep in mind it will not be activated automatically. Siphoning Trap is a brand new survivability trap that slows enemies and regens life and mana per enemy hit. If you can somehow find a decent unset ring, consider moving Siphoning Trap there and adding increased duration to the cast when damage taken setup. Since this is a Mind Over Matter build, it should be able to handle a maxed out cast when damage taken setup, so you can level up the Stone Golem fully. If you're not comfortable with this, try to find a good unset ring to put Summon Stone Golem in to cast manually, or don't fully link your armor piece with the cast when damage taken setup. While leveling, you get access to Explosive Trap very early on. Fire Trap will be available at level 12 from the Siren's Cadence quest. I'm assuming that Flamethrower Trap will be available from Act 3 by defeating Gravitius and requiring level 28. Be sure to pick up the required gems as you go and leveling them either on spare slots or on alternate weapons. In terms of DPS gearing, look for items that have fire damage, elemental damage, added fire damage, and or spell damage. Overall, this build should be a good league starter and carry you into acquiring your initial league currency, which you can either put into this build or fund an alternate character with. If you decide to pour your currency into this character, I'm sure you can push it even further with bossing. I have information about the build in a Google document below for easy reference, and also timestamps to each part of the guide in the description. I'll be updating the Google Doc as more information becomes available. If you have any questions about the build, feel free to ask. If you're new to Path of Exile, feel free to ask general questions as well. More people joining the game is always a great thing. If this helped you out, please consider leaving a like and or subscribing. It really helps out a lot, and I try to have a build video for the start of each new Path of Exile league. I am super hyped to play some Elementalist again with the Ignite buffs. Thank you so much for watching, and good luck in Incursion League, and until next time.